From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the library's Center for the Book, which means I am the book and reading promoter for the Library of Congress. I have a wonderful job because it brings me in touch not only with authors and writers, but with book people around the United States and around the world. One of the Center for the Book's features is a state Center for the Book in each state, as well as the District of Columbia. And they work hard to help us promote books and reading and literacy in libraries in each state. And in fact, one of the times I first met Sara Paretsky was at a function, an Illinois State Center book Authors Day and book exhibit. It's an event that has expanded quite a bit. As you know, we're here to celebrate a couple of occasions that have to do with the world of mysteries. But before we get started, I have to make a couple of announcements. One is, please make certain that your BlackBerries and your cell phones are all turned off. Secondly, the general plan is to have Sara speak, and we do have a book signing and reception to which everyone is invited following the presentation. We also are planning a question and answer session. And we hope that you will have questions, but I also must tell you that if you do have questions, when you stand and speak, you're giving the Library of Congress permission to take your image and put it on our website and your words as part of the webcasting that will be done on the Center for the Book's website. Now we have actual presentations of nearly 70 presentations by authors that have taken place in the last 4 or 5 years. I also want to remind you that for the National Book Festival, which is going into its 7th year, we also have presentations on the website of the book festival of more than 350 American authors, writers, and poets. So this is a resource that we're building, and I hope that you can take advantage of it. Today, our program with Sara marks the 25th anniversary of the debut of Sara's fictional detective, VI Warshawski, and the 20th anniversary of Sisters in Crime. You'll hear a little bit more about each organization as our evening proceeds. The event is co-sponsored by Mystery Writers of America, one of the Center for the Book's reading promotion partners, and with a special bow to Ellen Crosby, who is here, who had the idea, and along with Beth Foxwell, blackmailed me into doing this. That isn't true. I was very pleased to be able to do this, but they helped present the opportunity. Also, I should say that Beth is the managing editor of Clues, a journal of detection, and if you stick around tonight, you're going to have a chance to get a copy of the special issue that is devoted to Sara. As many of you know, Sara revolutionized the mystery world when she introduced the VI Warshawski character in her 1982 novel, Indemnity Only. By creating a strong female investigator who uses her wits as well as her fists, she challenged the conventions of a genre in which women traditionally were either vamps or victims. 11 other Warshawski novels followed, all national bestsellers, including Fire Sale, which you will have a chance to buy and get signed tonight. In addition to the Warshawski novels, Sara has written a non-series novel, Ghost Country, which blends comedy, magic, and witty realism in the streets of Chicago. She has also edited 3 collections of short stories, and her books are published in 24 languages. And she currently is at work on a collection of essays that will be published in 2007. Sara has been to the Library of Congress before, and to tell you briefly about a previous talk that Sara gave and her generosity to us, I'm pleased to introduce Tori Hill, who is acting chief of the library's Humanities and Social Sciences Division. Tori? Give Tori a hand.
Thank you, John, for giving me this opportunity to formally thank Sara Paretsky for the gift that she gave to the Library of Congress. She was here in 2001 and gave a talk which was fabulous, and we asked her if she would sign copies of the books that we had, of her books, that we had here at the library, which she willingly or not willingly did. But when she came to looking at the copies of Indemnity Only, and this is the better copy, she was surprised at how beaten up it was. We think this is a vase that somebody had put water on, or a cup of coffee, and the other copy looked even worse. When she got back home, she called us and offered to give us a signed first edition, dust-jacketed copy of Indemnity Only, and I don't have it here. It now resides in the Rare Book Room. So I just want to formally say thank you, thank you, thank you very much.
To introduce our speaker, I'm actually going to read something out of the copy that I hope you get tonight of this special issue. This comes from the introduction of the Sara Paretsky issue of Clues, a Journal of Detection. We are grateful, I must say, to Beth and to Heldriff for furnishing these copies. Here's what Margaret Kinsman, the editor, says in introducing this particular issue. This issue of Clues honors a special anniversary. 25 years ago, Sara Paretsky's now legendary detective, VI Warshawski, debuted in the 1982 novel Indemnity Only, and you've seen the Library of Congress's copy. Since then, in 12 novels and several short stories, the gutsy private eye, distinguished by her way with words and a deep-rooted concern for social justice, has provided an enduring figure on the landscape of modern crime and mystery fiction. Hailed from the start by readers and critics alike, VI, a self-identified feminist, is a compelling character who has continued to break the mold as she and the series acquire depth and longevity. A 2003 review of Paretsky's Blacklist noted, quote, "What's particularly amazing about the Warshawski books is that, unlike other long-running series that eventually begin to run on empty, these mysteries have grown richer and more ambitious with age." Happy 25th anniversary, Victoria Iphigenia Warshawski. We look forward to hearing more from and about you and from your creator, Sara Paretsky. Sara?
Thank you very much, John. When he emailed to ask if I would come tonight, he said, would I come to my favorite library? And he's absolutely right. There are many libraries that I love dearly, but this is my favorite. And so it's a great honor as well as a great pleasure to be here again tonight. I want to thank Ellen Crosby and the Mystery Writers of America also for making this happen, and especially Beth Foxwell for being willing to dedicate an issue of Clues to me and to the Girl Detective. Hilaire Belloc once said, "Though my sins be scarlet, may my books be red." And when I saw the Library of Congress's copy of Indemnity Only, I did feel that my books were red. I didn't realize that books circulated from here, but they do to members of Congress because it's their library. I was like, oh, duh. And this one had clearly been read in the bath. And that made me feel especially happy because I have a lot of books that are sort of warped and wavy in just that same way from having dropped them in the bath while reading them. I felt very flattered and honored to be the subject of an issue of Clues, but I was reading one of the essays and I found that I was a late-stage Fordist who was insufficiently aware of the implications of Fordism in my work, and that made me feel that I had a very limited understanding of what I wrote. V.I. Warshawski was born on July 27th with the sun in Leo and Gemini rising. Her chart reads, extremely active by nature, You like to get around and meet people. Very restless, you can't seem to stay put. Because of the high nervous tension you always have, athletic activity would be a good way for you to burn off energy. Well, VI grew up under the shadow of the old steel mills on Chicago's South Side. Her father was a cop, her mother a refugee from Mussolini's Italy. Her mother had aspired to an operatic career, but ended up giving music lessons to neighbors' children. She died when VI was around 16, a loss that still haunts the detective. Ages and times are a little bit fluid in VI's past. The 8 red Venetian wine glasses that her mother brought with her from her hometown in Umbria are VI's most prized possession. As her horoscope says, VI is impatient and restless. She doesn't stay home long enough to keep house. Although she likes good food, she often eats on the run, spilling chili down her favorite silk blouses because she's eating while driving. Very naughty. Actually, when my mother was dying and I was in daily touch with the brother who was living with her, I conscientiously pulled over to the curb one day while I was talking to him on the cell phone and told him what I was doing, and he said he commuted to work in a government van that was high off the ground, and he could see into cars. And aside from the meals people consumed, the fact that they had books open on their steering wheels or newspapers, he once passed a car where the driver was playing the tuba. So VI dropping chili on her silk blouses is, I guess, pretty tame. At least she's not dropping it down the whole of her tuba. She likes Johnny Walker Black, and she drinks red wine, especially from Torgiano, the hill country where her mother grew up. VI attended the University of Chicago on an athletic scholarship. She played basketball, and the University of Chicago was the first college in the nation to give women students athletic scholarships long before Title IX. She attended law school there as well, worked for several years in the Cook County Public Defender's Office before becoming a private investigator in 1982. VI was married once as a young woman, but the marriage lasted about 18 months. I guess that's long for someone trying to get along with as prickly a woman as VI is. These days, she lives alone, but shares 2 dogs with her neighbor, Mr. Contreras, who's a retired machinist, and his main hobby is VI herself. VI's chart adds that she is, quote, stubborn about her right to live her life according to her own principles. She appreciates truth and honesty. She practices it herself and expects it of others. I confess that I don't really hold much truck with horoscopes. The same website where I found VI's chart told me that George Bush is an empathic listener whose first goal is to respond to the needs of the people around him. But the stars and I were apparently in harmony a quarter-century ago. VI's web chart fits her to a T. The only career that suits her restless, active nature is that of private eye. I've had a fun journey with her from that first book where she was a brash 30-year-old proving she had a right to do her job. I'm a woman, Mr. Thayer, she tells her first client when he questions whether a girl can solve his problems. I can look after myself. If I couldn't, I wouldn't be in this kind of business. But where did my journey with VI start? How did I go from my own childhood in Kansas, where my writing was so personal that I never imagined other people might want to read it, to standing here tonight in the Library of Congress? Although I give a lot of public lectures, I don't often discuss my own writing. I think that's because I don't really know how to write. I don't know how I do what I do. I've never had any technical training as a writer, and I'm afraid if I tinker with the mechanism too much by thinking about it or talking about it, that my writing will leave me as mysteriously as it came. Now, my husband is a thoroughgoing WASP, or as he prefers to call himself, a was. On top of that, he's a scientist, a physicist, so neither by birth nor training can he have any empathy with the mind of a Polish peasant who fears the evil eye. But that's me, or at least it's one aspect of me. One of my grandmothers was an immigrant from Eastern Europe who came to America when she was not quite 13. Although she was well educated for a poor Jewish girl, she also brought with her many of the country beliefs of the Polish peasants. It was from this grandmother that I learned of the evil eye that infallibly pounces on those who brag about anything, their children, their own looks, the intelligence of anyone in their families. Many were the horrific examples I heard of children crippled by polio or reduced to idiocy from terrible street accidents after their mothers had bragged about the beauty or gifts of their offspring. And as to the fate that afflicted women who boasted of their own abilities, well, everyone in this room would leave the library with hair whiter than mine if I repeated those disasters. The evil eye never sleeps. The grandmother who taught me about the evil eye told me never to say Gesundheit to someone who's coughing because that inevitably brings on a fatal coughing fit. She also told me never to hold a baby shower for a pregnant friend because baby showers cause the woman to miscarry. Perhaps it's this belief that we all have the power to kill others merely by saying Gesundheit at the wrong or maybe the right moment that prompted me to write murder mysteries. But whatever lay behind that choice, I will not bring on the evil eye by saying I am a writer. Instead, I'll talk a bit about how I came to find my own voice. When John Updike published the final novel in his Rabbit series, he wrote a front-page essay for the New York Times Book Review discussing the end of Rabbit, as well as the depression in which he found himself at the time of the essay. In the piece, he tells how he came to write the first Rabbit novel in a small town in Massachusetts. He'd moved to Ipswich, he said, in an effort to get away from the charms and distractions of New York City. I had done my New York thing. I could tell uptown from downtown. I had undergone the Manhattan initiation rites that writers should undergo. Well, I read this passage and I thought, maybe that's what's wrong with me, or not wrong, but maybe it's what keeps me from feeling connected to the world of real writers, because I haven't undergone the Manhattan initiation rites that writers should undergo. But then I remembered that, strictly speaking, this wasn't true. When I was 23, I actually did move briefly to New York, hoping to become a writer. It had apparently been driven into my unconscious from childhood on, as it had been in Updike's, that to be a writer meant living in New York. Now, in connection with this fantasy of New York as the sine qua non for would-be writers, I have a somewhat shameful confession to make. It's something I don't usually reveal in public, but in these days of 24-hour journalism, everyone's deepest secrets are endlessly churned on Fox, or even worse, on YouTube. So before you hear about me from Chris Matthews or on the net, I will bear all here in public, and for the camera. There was actually a time in the 60s when I was a Mets fan. It makes me squirm to acknowledge it, and I can only say in mitigation that I was still living in Kansas then, and the Kansas City Athletics, now the Oakland A's, were a more pathetic team than the Cubs could ever hope to be. I don't know why the A's only started winning championships when Finley moved them to Oakland. I don't know why he couldn't do that in Kansas City. Anyway, it wasn't long after moving to Chicago that I came to my senses and turned my devotion to the Cubs. And I should say that the Cubs are one of the many things that gives a Chicagoan a better grounding for the arts than they can get in New York, because it's a well-known truth that great art is built on suffering. Anyway, I went to New York the summer I turned 23, hoping to become a writer. I didn't have any money other than what I could earn by working. I didn't have a fantasy of finding a garret and writing some amazing novel, because in New York, even a garret, even in 1970, you had to have some serious money to support it. And I really wasn't imagining writing a novel. I knew I was quick with words and I could write well enough for other people to like what I said. But in the milieu where I'd grown up, novels belonged to people who were smarter, more interesting, and more male than I was. My ignorance of the writing world was profound. I thought I could show the New Yorker or New York or the dailies or any of the thousands of magazines and papers published there, examples of my unpublished short stories and history essays. Yes, what a portfolio. And someone might take me on in a very junior capacity. I didn't realize then that good journalism was as demanding as good fiction. I just thought fast turnaround, clever phrases, I can do that. So armed with $200 that I'd scraped together from odd jobs and borrowed from a friend, I made the rounds, but I never got past the front desk because I had no contacts. I was so ignorant that I didn't know you needed a sponsor to get into any of those places. And even if I had known, I was too shy and remote, I think, to figure out how to get someone to be interested in me. It's possible, too, that my skills, both now and then, were not best suited for journalism, but I never got far enough in the process to have them evaluated. The only publication that would talk to me was Time, and they wanted me to be a typist in their billing department. When I was 23, you could survive for a couple of weeks on $200, even in New York City. But as my grace period drew to a close and I began to panic about what I might live on, I fulfilled my destiny. I became a secretary. After 4 months of that, I decided to return to Chicago. I could be a secretary there just as easily, and Chicago offered certain advantages over New York in those days. For instance, in Chicago, when you picked up a phone to make a call, you could count on getting a dial tone. In New York at that time, you might wait up to half an hour for one, and given the rate of forcible break-ins on the part of the Upper West Side where I found an apartment to share, a dial tone seemed more like a necessity than a luxury. There actually was a night when a couple of guys tried to break into the apartment that I found to share. The two women I was rooming with had inherited it from some women who were call girls, and two of their dissatisfied customers had come looking for them. Or maybe they were overly satisfied customers, I don't know. I just know they were trying to break the door down. Now, a real writer would have rejoiced in this opportunity to experience life at its rawest, but I tried to call the cops, and I couldn't get a dial tone. New York Bell had installed 100,000 new phones that summer without adding any extra lines. That was the problem. One of my roommates had a motorcycle which she kept in our apartment to keep it from evaporating on the street. So she turned on the engine, and I guess the guys outside thought we had a chainsaw at the ready. So they fled, and we stopped trying to reach the police. I should point out in passing, maybe I shouldn't point out in passing, but I will, that when my agent sent my first book, Indemnity Only, out, a lot of editors turned it down for a lot of reasons, but a number turned it down because of the Chicago setting. They didn't think PI novels worked outside of California or New York. In fact, they didn't think people read outside of New York, because one editor actually wrote that a book set in Chicago had regional interest only, and that not enough people read in the Midwest to make it worth the expense of publishing a local novel. I've always thought that publishers might have imagined that in Chicago, because we could get a dial tone, we just spent all of our life on the phone. Of course, that was in the days before everyone stopped reading because they were all plugged into their phones 24 hours a day. When I say that I fulfilled my destiny in becoming a secretary, I refer to the external expectations for my life in the world in which I was raised. I grew up in rural Kansas in the 50s. Some people think of this as a golden age of America, a society where everyone had a defined place, where everyone knew right from wrong and what happened to you when you forgot it. We had mandatory Protestant prayer in our public schools every morning. Every Easter, the high school held a religious revival in the school auditorium. Again, attendance was compulsory. In 1964, when a handful of brazen protesters, which included me, 3 Catholic girls, and 1 boy whose parents shocked the town with their public proclamations of atheism, when we claimed First Amendment protection against attendance, we were locked in a small room next to the principal's office for the day of the revival service. I don't know what they would have done if there had been a fire. Maybe they would have rejoiced in the destruction of the heathen. This same high school barred black students from college track courses, and in those golden days, African Americans knew better than to agitate against such exclusion. Abortion was a crime for everyone, or at least it was a crime for all women, not just those on welfare. Only bad girls had sex outside marriage, whereupon they reaped their inevitable punishment, since such contraceptives as existed were not available to unmarried women. You could be 40 years old and embarked on a love affair, but if you were not married, doctors in Kansas, as in many other states, were prohibited by law from prescribing contraception for you. In that era, we little girls knew we were destined to be mommies. We didn't worry about careers. Except for a handful of married teachers or secretaries or nurses, the only women who worked were those who were too strange or too unfortunate in our eyes to get husbands. We didn't understand anything back then about the economic pressures that force some women into the workplace, or about the dreams and desires that make others want to be there. While boys wanted to be cowboys or firefighters, we girls dreamed of our weddings. When Roxanne Farrell had to get married in our sophomore year of high school, to us the most tawdry part was that she bought her trousseau at Woolworth's. Good girls who waited until they graduated from high school or college bought fancy bridal wear at the Plaza in Kansas City. In the minds of writers like Ann Coulter and Danielle Crittenden, in the view of the dominant voices setting public policy today, in the speech of talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh, we are seeing a strong push to return to the days of my youth. Indeed, when I see that 46 states have passed laws allowing pharmacists, hospitals, and doctors to opt out of all or part of reproductive services, or when I read abstinence-only materials that tell girls never, quote, never, never act too smart because nature and God intend girls to be subordinate to boys, and when I know that we are spending $200 million a year to provide these materials as the only publicly funded sex education in our public schools, or when people like Tom DeLay blame social ills on women working outside the home, I fear we are moving perilously close to my Kansas childhood. Although at least 50 years ago, Kansas children were allowed to study evolution. But actually, in the wake of Columbine, Tom DeLay actually got up in Congress and blamed the shootings there on 2 things. You can read this in the congressional record. He said it was women working outside the home and teaching children evolution. He said they could no longer tell the difference between themselves and monkeys. Although I've never yet seen a monkey with an automatic weapon. Male writers, male writers such as Sartre and Bellow have recorded knowing early in life that their destiny lay in literature.
Bellow says he was born to be a performing, Bellow says that he was born to be a performing and interpretive creature, Sartre that he was born for words. In his memoir, The Words, Sartre writes that his mother existed to serve him. In fact, when he was a small boy, she used to bind his childish writings into books and force the neighbors to read them. In an essay called Writers and Literature in American Society, Saul Bellow explains how in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, he lived with his first wife and her mother in her mother's apartment. His wife had a job to support the household, his mother-in-law kept house, and Saul had a card table in the back of the apartment where he was supposed to write. His purpose in telling us this story is not to thank these sacrificing women, but to explain how difficult it was to be creative with his mother-in-law hovering all day in her own apartment. I have to say that by the end of the essay, the sensitive reader is indeed weeping over his plight. Mr. Bellow used to teach at the University of, oh, I won't, don't go there, Sarah. Now, my experience was somewhat different. I raised my two youngest brothers, one born when I was 9, the other 4 years later. I cleaned the house every Saturday for my family. When I was 7, my mother stood me on a chair next to the kitchen counter and had me bake a cake and cookies for my father and brothers. Thus began a weekly baking stint that lasted until I left that house at the age of 17. I would have made somebody a good old-fashioned kind of wife. It wasn't that I fought my destiny, it just never came up to meet me. My father used to assure me when I was young that my childhood writing was derivative, that I lacked the genius necessary for originality. My mother, bitter over the doors that had closed on her, some by her choice, others by social constraints, angrily sought to keep me in the same box. For much of my early life, I retreated from the violence and the meanness around me into a world of daydreams. Oh, John, thank you. The books I read and the stories I wove out of them about my own life, miraculously altered, became more present for me than the dull routine around me. In adolescence, I discovered the world of English crime novels. Peter Wimsey and Albert Campion were particularly beguiling because they dwelt in a land of manners, wealth, and especially of order. It was the orderliness, the good manners, and the elegant repartee that I coveted, not the puzzles that Campion or Wimsey solved. From about the age of 13 on, I read crime novels in preference to almost any other kind of book. In fact, so much so that when I took my PhD history orals at the University of Chicago, I read some 24 crime novels the month before my exams. It just took me a while to figure out what my real destiny was. But as I became a more sophisticated reader, I also discovered that the lives of women in fiction were as limited as my own. Broadly speaking, women in the mystery have been the inconstant, deceptive, manipulative monsters of whom the archetype is Bridget O'Shaughnessy in The Maltese Falcon. Or they have been the innocent virginal types who get themselves in a peck of trouble and are rescued by a male hero. Even Harriet Vane and the combined female intelligences of Shrewsbury or maybe Shrewsbury College need Peter Wimsey to rescue them, and Dorothy Sayers labeled herself as a feminist. Crime fiction throughout much of the past 100 years supported the values of America's golden age. Good girls were chaste, bad girls were not. In an English mystery, if you met a divorced woman, she was inevitably going to be up to no good because she was implicitly sexually available. Widows were too, for some reason. I don't know what they did wrong. Now, chaste girls just couldn't act at all. Bad girls could, but they were only able to commit evil deeds. Notable 20th century heroines include Carmen Sternwood of The Big Sleep. The first time Carmen sees Philip Marlowe in the hallway of her father's house, she greets him just as you or I might welcome a stranger. Marlowe tells us, "She turned her body slowly and lithely without lifting her feet. Her hands dropped limp at her sides. She tilted herself toward me on her toes. She fell straight back into my arms. I had to catch her or let her crack her head on the tessellated floor. I caught her under her arms and she went rubber-legged on me instantly. I had to hold her close to hold her up. When her head was against my chest, she screwed it around and giggled at me." Now, please don't try this maneuver at home without adult supervision. I always get lost between going rubber-legged and leaning forward and tilting backwards. At the end of this complicated novel, which is filled with so many murders that Chandler famously couldn't account for one of the bodies during the film adaptation, it turns out that while it's true Carmen did kill, I think, one person, maybe two, herself, all of the many murders in the book were committed by men whom she had driven past the point of reason with her sexuality. Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about Carmen after I read The Big Sleep. Of course, The Big Sleep is a novel, it's fiction. So is the widely hailed Miracle Game by the Czech writer Joseph Paretsky. I can't pronounce it. It's Skvorecky. Anyway, in the novel, The Miracle Game, the corruption in the Czech government, the crushing of the 1968 Prague Spring, were both caused by the duplicity of a highly sexed female university student who worked for the secret police, had sex with her professors and colleagues, and then betrayed them all to the secret police. The story of Eve is also fiction. Eve, who uses her brand new, never road-tested sexual powers to get Adam to eat the apple. The winter I first read Chandler, I began to think that all these fictions were designed to put me in a box, to reinforce the invidious lessons of my own childhood. From my first reading of Chandler and the other American noir writers when I was in my 20s, I wanted to create a female detective who turned the tables on these negative images of women. But I was still living then in a world of daydreams. Writing seemed as inaccessible to me as climbing Mount Everest or dancing with the Kirov, two other fantasies. For years after reading The Big Sleep, I had a daydream of seeing myself with a finished, published book, but I did little to make that happen. I imagined a very hard-boiled detective, a woman named Minerva Daniels, who drank cheap bar whiskey and chain-smoked. Two bad habits for a detective that I would write about, because I've never smoked, and if you're not a smoker, you don't know when people are going to want to light up and when they're craving that nicotine. And then also, when I finally did get to VI, I thought, I don't drink cheap whiskey, and she's taking a lot more hits than I am, so I gave her my whiskey, Black Label. But Minerva drank rotgut. And in the middle of the night, a guy with slim hips and broad shoulders would come to her office. He would offer a fake name. He would come on to her sexually and then turn out to be the main villain. Well, during 8 years, I think I wrote about 10 pages on Minerva and gave up, maybe just as well, because good parody takes a much different sensibility than mine to execute well. So all these years passed with me just daydreaming about writing. And then I turned 31, and it dawned on me that if I didn't sit down and write a book, it would never happen. So that year, I gave myself the goal of writing a detective novel or giving it up along with the notion that I might muscle Margaret Fontaine away from Nureyev, or Nureyev away from her, I guess I should say. Now, at the time, I was working as a manager for CNA Insurance in Chicago, and my boss was a guy who had, well, let's just say he had issues with women. Among other things, he used to bet with his colleagues on how long it would take him to make a woman break down and cry in a meeting with the chairman. So I can still remember the day that I was at a meeting in his office. I was looking out his window at the naked trees in Grant Park on a dreary October afternoon. My lips were saying, "Gosh, heck of an idea, Brownie," but the balloon over my head had something unprintable in it. And at that moment, VI did come to me. It truly did happen like that. I was thinking private thoughts on company time. I realized that I didn't want Philip Marlowe in drag. I wanted a woman like me and my friends. Like us, my detective was doing a job that hadn't existed for women when we were in school. She was facing the same kinds of obstacles that we did in those days. But unlike us, my detective wouldn't worry about getting fired. She wouldn't worry about whether people thought she was a nice person or not. She would call things as she saw them, and she wouldn't take crap from anyone. Even so, when I finally came to write Indemnity Only, it was with Chandler's The High Window open in my lap. Philip Marlowe got beaten up a third of the way into the novel. VI got beaten up a third of the way into Indemnity Only. Marlowe doesn't have siblings. None for poor old VI. He's an orphan. Poof, just like that. There went VI's beloved mother, Gabriella. Talk about letting men define your experience. Oy, oy, oy. The one aspect of my detective I was thinking about deliberately was her sexuality and the role of sex in my stories. Serial killers who prey on women or children, rapists who torture women or children, play an enormous and enormously titillating as well as lucrative role in today's fiction and film. I vowed not to use sex to exploit my characters or my readers. I also wanted my hero, VI, to be a sexual being and a moral person at the same time. Too often, the unmarried career woman in the modern mystery has depraved sexual appetites and has to die, as was true of Carolyn Polhemus in Presumed Innocent, or Alex Forrest in Fatal Attraction. In other cases, she may not be depraved, but her appetites take an enormous amount of satiation. VI's emotional involvements do sometimes cloud her judgment, whether in thinking about her friends or her lovers. That's just a fact of life for women and men both. But her sexuality doesn't stop her from making clear moral judgments, and nor does it stop her from being able to act and to solve problems. In the years since my first book appeared, we've seen enormous changes in the mystery. Whereas it took me almost a year to find a publisher willing to gamble on a woman detective in America's third largest city, we now have so many books by women with women heroes that I can't keep track of them. Women now routinely review books in places like the New York Times, and our books are routinely reviewed there as well. In 1982, it was still rare for high prestige publications to look at works by women. At the same time, books and movies still all too often take a look at women only in the tired old ways. In the last 10 or 15 years, as women's voices have grown stronger, the punishment meted out to active women has also increased, at least in fiction. They may have to be murdered, as happens in Presumed Innocent. They may have to be brutalized, as happens to Karen Winterman in Haywood Gould's Double Bang. In Rising Sun, the action turns on the murder of a woman who engages in masochistic sex. In the movie version, at least, we are repeatedly shown a video, both of her masochism and her murder. In review after review, papers and magazines brooded on the negative image the movie presented of the Japanese, but not one mentioned the degradation of the murder victim. We take women's rape and dismemberment so much for granted as a part of action movies. This sadism has been a growth industry. Despite the many welcome changes of the last 20 years, we are bombarded with books, with movies, songs, and above all, video games, which show women being violated in horrific ways. These run the gamut from mainstream films, where women's chief role is as prostitute. Witness the successful re-release of Sharon Stone's Basic Instinct in 2006, which includes what one reviewer referred to as, quote, the classic film moment of Sharon Stone's spread-legged interrogation, to video games where players can rape, maim, and kill misbehaving prostitutes. Like the prostitute who cheers up Clark Gable in Gone with the Wind, in fiction and in film, the woman who understands that she really is a whore is a contented animal, happy to be able to have this kind of easy camaraderie with men through her body. The same woman appears in contemporary film and fiction, as Robert Parker's widely praised Hooker in Distress, April Kyle, demonstrates. These depictions are very remote from reality. Most American sex workers were sexually abused as children. They become prostitutes because they were conditioned as children to believe that they existed only in the body and only to respond to others' sexual needs. There are no completely accurate data on how many children in America are sexually abused. Studies of sexual violence against girls show a range of 1 in 4 to 1 in 8. For boys, the figure is about 1 in 10. Even the most conservative estimates show a staggering amount of violence against our children. Assault against children causes long-term, irremediable damage, and to glamorize it by showing prostitutes as provocative, as enjoying violation as a game, only deepens the problem. I'm part of the Woodstock generation. It's easy to mock the kids in the mud with the clouds of reefer smoke overhead, but there was another aspect to that time as well. We were imbued with an optimism, an idealism, an intensity that made us think we really could change the world. People like me grew up on the civil rights movement. It was that movement that first brought me to Chicago in 1966 to do community service work in the neighborhood where Martin Luther King was trying to create open housing and equal pay for African Americans. That movement led me into feminism as well, and the hope that we could end centuries of wrong in American race relations and millennia of wrong in women's lives. When I started writing Indemnity Only, I hoped my vision might be part of the work that would forever change women's lives. Now I see that there are many kinds of radicalism. Only one of them is my wish for a world in which women are judged, so to speak, not by the shape of our bodies, but by the quality of our work and the ardor of our dreams. Against that vision is an angry radicalism that wants us forever boxed in by our anatomy. I hope it is my vision that will prevail, but I have no crystal ball. I can't predict what will survive. I'm almost 60 now, which seems horrible. I don't have, as Tennyson put it, the strength which in old days moved heaven and earth. All I have is hope, and a hope that my writer's voice, which I came to in a very hard way, and that your support as readers which I value more than I can rightly say, that these will be enough to give me strength for the journey. Thank you very much. Thanks. I'll certainly be glad to answer any questions or listen to any answers of my unanswered questions, if there are any. Yes.
First of all, I can't speak for everyone here, but I want to thank you for your continued perseverance in depicting people as they are, ordinary people and women, in the way you have just expressed it in your books. It's truly a marvelous thing. And what I wanted to say is that I'm so glad that some members of Congress, I hope, are reading your books. The current administration, but anyway, I wanted to ask you, your books are very much part of the moment, without being preachy, but they address some of the key issues of the times. And how do you, when you begin to write, you know, how do you weave this in? Because I think it is woven in very seamlessly and as a part of the artistic effort and as a part of the artistic product.
Thanks very much. The question was, since my books often address things that are rather topical, how do I make that choice, and how do I keep from being on a soapbox, which I hope I do. I don't like propaganda novels, books that are just written to prove that 4 legs are good or 2 legs are better. I don't like to read them, and I certainly hope I'm not writing them. I sometimes think that if I backed away from those kinds of things, I might write more enduring fiction, but you really can only write what's in you to write, and I can only write when I feel really passionately engaged with the material. When I started the series, I think I got very good advice from Stuart Kaminsky, who taught a class in a night extension course that I took and really helped me get my first book shaped and going. And he suggested, since I was working in the financial world, to have my detectives specialize in white-collar crime. And it was a very good suggestion. And a lot of the crimes that I write about are things that I read about in the Wall Street Journal or the financial pages of the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune. And I keep a kind of a file on things that might be interesting, but it has to be the right kind of story to work with VI. I don't ever start with an issue and think, okay, now Joan of Arc has to get on her horse and deal with this. I usually start with the idea of a crime. For instance, a book I wrote called Bloodshot was suggested by a book called Outrageous Misconduct, which was about some issues in the asbestos mining business. And I thought, that's a good crime, that would make a good story. But I can't actually begin to tell the story until I have characters who are speaking to me. And in that particular case, I think I started the book 8 times before I finally had people who really talked to me and who were telling a story that could carry the crime kind of underneath it. When you're writing hard-boiled fiction, you're not planting clues exactly in the way you are when you're writing a novel of manners, the English novels of manners that I enjoyed so much in my 20s. But the hand has to be quicker than the eye. You have to be having the focus so much on the emotional drama of the lives of the people that the reader is not noticing the truth about who is doing what. And sometimes I do that more successfully than others, and I think I do it most successfully when I'm really most engaged with the lives of the characters that I've thought of. Yeah, in the back and then in the front.
One of your favorite characters to bit about how you came to sort of include that and the relationship between Lottie and VI?
The question had to do with Lottie Herschel and her relationship with VI, and also how I came to include some issues about the Holocaust in the book Total Recall. Lottie was a sort of, I can't think of what the right word is, but she wasn't someone I had planned from the beginning. She was someone who showed up when VI needed to see a doctor, and I didn't want her going to a hospital. I wanted her just having a friend she could call on. And Lottie turned out to be that person. I never imagined her. Well, I really wasn't imagining this whole series when I started. I was trying to write a book. But I hadn't thought her out as the person that she really grew into. But I think when I look at Lottie, who I see is my immigrant grandmother, who wasn't much like her in some ways, but had enormous energy, and my abiding image of my granny. She was 4'11", and I have to keep saying that because she kind of projected 6 feet. She just had so much energy. And she had earrings that were shaped, they were jet earrings in the shape of a bunch of grapes, and they just were always in motion, vibrating with her. And Lottie's intensity really reflects much more that aspect of my life and this important woman in my life than VI herself actually does. The Holocaust is in a way part of my own personal history, and it's always been a sort of a stumbling block in how I think about my life and past and many of those things. And in some ways, Lottie was a bridge I was able to make in integrating some of those issues into my life. I think it's very tricky to write about the Holocaust. It is so kitschified and so reified in a way. I was very hestant to take it up, except in a really indirect, very minimalist way, and that's what I did with Total Recall. There are 6 chapters in that book that are told in Lottie's voice, and they are set in her past when she came with the Kindertransport from Vienna to London, and they are from her past. And I did toy with the idea of doing a whole novel in her voice, and I was just daunted by the amount of research I would have to do to write an authentic novel set in Britain in the war years. And as it was, man, the opening paragraph, she talks about putting 6pences or 6-penny pieces, or I can't even remember what word I used now, to feed the gas meter. And I asked my agent who grew up in England and my English agent and my English editor, what should it be? And they all agreed on whatever word it was I ended up using. And then I got massive amounts of mail from English readers saying, no, nobody called them 6-penny whatever I said they were. They always called them whatever else it was. And Lottie wore tights. Well, women didn't call their stockings tights until pantyhose came in. And, you know, just those mistakes told me I had made a really good decision in not setting a whole novel in London in the 40s. And you had a question?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your words. They've been very inspiring to me.
Oh, thank you.
As a writer, particularly as a writer whose protagonists are women.
Huh.
It feels like an uphill battle sometimes.
Yeah.
But well worth it. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the future of fiction in America and what you see as the future of the book as a physical entity.
Help. The question was was my thoughts on the future of fiction and the future of the book as a physical entity. Well, on my good days, I think that until they make a computer that can survive being dropped in the bathtub, the book is here to stay. I mean, the book is the perfect size and shape and delivery vehicle for the written word, I think. But then what do I know? I didn't grow up with a machine plugged into my fingertips. I think people have always experimented with new kinds of fiction. Hypertext was very popular a few years ago. But I do believe that there's an abiding need in people for stories, and that stories will survive. I don't know that they will always survive in the form that we see them now, but except for the fact that we read them in books instead of listening to them spoken by poets, I don't think our stories differ very much from the stories that people loved and responded to 3,000 years ago. We want heroes of one kind or another to bring us comfort on this very lonely journey that life is in the end. And stories tell that, and they give us a sense of closure. And I think that we will never lose our yearning for those things. I don't think, people aren't reading perhaps quite as much as they read 10 years ago, but I also think that not that many people have ever been as addicted to the book as we in this room are. You want me to stop?
No. Just whenever you're done, Sarah, then we're going to move to the next stage.
Okay.
Please continue.
I taught writing at the University of Chicago about 4 years ago, and the kids there, they're very unsophisticated as writers. They're very smart, but they're very raw. I'll tell you what I loved, though, was they read everything. I couldn't believe how widely and how deeply they read, and I walked away thinking, yes, the written word will endure, and I hope that that's true. Thanks very much.
I'd like to ask Beth Foxwell to come up and to have the final word tonight. Beth is the managing editor of Clues, one of our sponsors tonight. Beth?
Elizabeth Peters talks about the bellwether of popularity as pizza stains on her pages of her books, and I think the coffee stain ranks with that, Sara. You'll probably not be surprised to learn that during her long career, Sara Paretsky has worn more than one hat, and I find myself here in more than one chapeau, or fedora, to try to address those many roles. On behalf of Margaret Kinsman, the executive editor of Clues, Sisters in Crime, the organization which Sara co-founded 20 years ago to foster the work of women mystery writers, and Mystery Writers of America, I want to express our gratitude for her considerable contributions in establishing, in conjunction with colleagues such as Maxine O'Callaghan, Marcia Muller, and Julie Smith, the modern female PI. With today's plethora of mystery choices, it's often forgotten that when Sara and her colleagues were starting out, there was a certain attitude in publishing that readers were not interested in such a character and the stories she could tell, which of course has since been soundly and roundly refuted. The issue of Clues that Drs. Cole and Paretsky mentioned earlier is dedicated to exploring the many facets of VI Warshawski, and we at Heldriff Publications hope that you and other fans of Sara and VI will enjoy the issue. In addition, Sara's contributions to feminist and political thought have been substantial, and we'll have Writing in an Age of Silence out in May from Verso that goes further into the themes that have illuminated her life. So thank you, Sara, for your work, for your example, for your contributions to the field, and thanks to all of you for attending this event.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.